Anand Stanley, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Is the era of flying over? We won't need plane makers like you anymore?
No, I hope not. I think let's be more optimistic about it. We did have a black swan event with the pandemic, but I do believe that we live in a connected world and a connected society, and it has to come back.
So how is Airbus experiencing this, and does this mean that you see it changing forever or just for a couple of years?
Well, this pandemic has been very deep and very difficult, not just for Airbus, but for the industry as a whole, and particularly for the airlines. And we're in it. We are trying to adapt. We're trying to help our customers, the airlines, to survive. At the end of the day, we just don't want them to survive. We all need to not just survive, but thrive and come out of this stronger. But it will be a long recovery.
You say not just survive, but at the moment that's what's happening. We are actually having airlines that are on the cusp of or are actually going bust. So how's that going to improve things for you? They won't want planes anymore.
Well, it is a demand problem that we have. People actually want to fly, but they're unable to fly. So the question is, how do we start and restart flying as soon as possible? And us as an industry are trying to work together on this to figure out how do we work with governments, how do we work with ecosystems to start air travel again and bring back the industry and nurse it back to health.
What are you saying to Asian governments in particular? Are you telling them you need to open up faster, this is going too slow?
Well, when I say we, it's the industry as a whole. It's not just a single company. And when I say industry, it's airports, it's airlines, it's the entire ecosystem. Let me put it in perspective. The aviation industry drives about $1 trillion in the Asia-Pacific region, about 50 million jobs. So it's quite significant. We need the governments to hold our hands, the industry as a whole, and start restarting air travel by opening borders.
So faster opening of borders?
Faster opening of borders, more evidence-based strategies, more risk-based strategies where we're going to more of a testing regime rather than just closing borders, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, especially in the ASEAN region, because the Asia-Pacific region is the worst hit in terms of traffic in the world compared to any other region.
Yet if you look at the numbers, it's quite varied. I mean, at the moment, India has some very bad numbers, but if we look at other parts of Asia, the Chinese market appears to be having it under control. So what kind of timeline are you sort of urging governments to look at? In other words, are we talking about weeks or are we talking about next year?
I mean, I'm talking about yesterday. If I were to be, I think there needs to be a real sense of urgency here, because it's a very astute observation when you say that there are certain domestic markets that are recovering within those countries, China or Vietnam to name a few. But when you look at the ASEAN, intra-regional traffic, the borders are still closed. The green lanes we're talking about are a handful of passengers a day. We need to move beyond green lanes to bubbles and finally lifting of air travel while managing the risk and while keeping safety at the utmost priority. I applaud the Singapore government here. They've really been progressive in terms of how they're trying to open up, even unilaterally if needed. But we need to open up and I would say it's not weeks. We need to be faster than that.
What about people, though, and the governments also, who argue that this is essentially a self-serving thing that you're doing? You're, of course, urging this because you're a plane maker. So you want people to travel. On the other hand, keeping the borders sealed keeps the numbers down.
But aviation is at the heart of the economies in the Asia-Pacific region. It's not about one link in the chain. It's about the entire chain itself. Aviation drives up to 3% of the GDP in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's not about a single entity. And it's absolutely critical. We've seen in a lot of the ASEAN countries, as aviation has gone up, the quality of life, the living conditions have gone up, and we need that to continue on and to continue to grow. So I think it's a bigger story than that.
Bright story over the last few weeks, and that has been a hydrogen-powered plane, the space-age idea that maybe this is also a time to do the green solution. When would you and I be able to actually sit in such a hydrogen-powered plane?
Well, I would love that day to come when you and I can sit in that plane. We're very excited to have launched three concepts actually about a hydrogen-powered plane, and we're hoping to have the launch by 2035, which in aviation terms is quite a short time period. And
that's 15 years away though for us normal people. Seems quite far.
It is, and it is a blink of an eye when you're developing a new platform.
This plane, though, how is it going to be different from other concepts? I mean, the idea of a hydrogen-powered vehicle, be it cars or planes, has been around for a while. And one of the major bugbears has been that hydrogen is pretty unstable. How is Airbus going to get over that very sort of fundamental thing about making sure that hydrogen is stable enough and stored in the plane in such a way that it would make for good regular air travel?
So that's a great question, and there are a few misconceptions which are out there. Hydrogen is actually very safe, very versatile, it's light, and it's storable. Hydrogen is actually, when we look at the different renewable fuels out there, it is no less safe than any of the traditional fuels. Hydrogen is the lightest element that's out there, so even in the case of a leak, it dissipates. So it's a very attractive and safe option.
But doesn't it occupy a lot more space than a normal fossil fuel, normal oil would contain? So you'd have to have a much larger fuselage on these types of planes? That's
a great observation. Hydrogen does take up more volume, which we will have to look into the design aspects of it. But hydrogen also has 3 times the energy density as a traditional fuel. It is also 3 times lighter than a traditional fuel. So there are a lot of advantages with it. And in its cryogenic form, it offers other advantages in terms of space.
In other words, when it's very, very chilled down. The money aspect. I know you've been avoiding this, but again, hydrogen is expensive. It's more expensive than our normal fossil fuels at the moment. So converting to hydrogen-powered planes, if one were to do it in any larger scale, other than it being charming, would end up being very expensive, unless you're seeing a very sharp change in the cost of hydrogen in the next 15 years.
And here's where I would make an appeal, because the only way to make this successful, if it is an industry-wide, global effort, because you need to work with right from the manufacturers of the fuel to the transporters to the entire ecosystem, and there has to be tremendous government support to achieve this goal of a decarbonized world.
Let's look at the individual planes though. Given that it looks as if we're not going to have these long flights anymore, is this going to change very much what Airbus is going to be producing? Gone is the long haul?
Well, I would not link the pandemic to the size of the aircraft. I would actually dissociate that theory. What we are seeing is, as borders are closed, it's mostly domestic traffic that is today there. And depending on the size of the country, it could be large planes that are flying. But more importantly, once the borders open, we will start to see intra-country regional travel open up. And finally, long distance. It is a long, long recovery. So we're talking about at least 3 years of a recovery. In some cases, it could go up to 4 or 5. But what I would like to say is the preference is not so much about the size of the aircraft. What we are seeing is airlines are using more efficient aircraft today in the time of the pandemic, because efficient aircraft can save up to 25%, a quarter of fuel.
Do you see any of the airlines, though, asking you to reconfigure, rearrange the seating arrangements in the planes so that there is more social distancing, so there's greater gaps between the seats?
Not really, not really. I don't think so. But what we have seen is that regulators and airlines on their own are managing their passenger experience and their passenger boarding on their own. What we are seeing is airlines engaging us and us working as a team to try and reverse the deep and difficult pandemic, where we're trying to work on demand and not so much on the seating.
What about the planes, though, that you haven't delivered? Some commentators who go out there and literally count the number of planes say that between Boeing and Airbus, there could be up to 600 planes that have not been delivered this year. Is that ballpark right for Airbus, that you're probably at about 200 planes that you haven't delivered this year?
I cannot comment on the exact numbers as of now, but what I can tell you is the focus right now is on working with the customers who are right in the middle of the crisis, trying to help them adapt and trying to help them cope with the situation that is in. Even though as hard as it may be for Airbus, the focus right now is on our customers.
What exactly does that mean, in the sense, are you saying to them, you know what, it's okay, don't take delivery of this? Is that what you're saying? Or pay me later, it's all right? Is that in practical terms what you're saying to them?
Not at all. I think the customer discussions are very different from customer to customer, and they're also confidential, so the details may vary from customer to customer. It's also about how do we help them in terms of the studies on safety, how do we help them in terms of conversations with the governments. So it is much more of a partnership than a transactional conversation.
But money at the end of the day will be what it's about. Airbus and Boeing exist also because it's very, very hard to build planes. It's very, very expensive. These come from massive collaborations and massive support from governments in Europe for Airbus and in the US for Boeing. So you must be considering the bottom line. This must hurt.
And the best way to help the industry in this crisis is twofold. One is to get the flights back in the air. There's nothing that can bring back health into the ecosystem than aircraft flying. The second way, which we also encourage a lot, is, and we are grateful to governments that are doing this, is for the governments to support their airlines during this tough period. I think that's the crux of the solution, more than transactional conversations.
Regional travel seems to be the one happy story that's coming out now. In China, regional travel really is picking up. Forecasts even say that possibly domestic travel in China is going to be higher than it was this October than it was in pre-COVID times, because people are stuck to staying only in China and traveling within China. Does that mean, though, that Asian travel in general is also going to move in that direction? And would it also mean that Airbus is going to face some competition from Chinese manufacturers? The Chinese have already made some moves towards looking to producing their own planes. Comac is one of them, and they could be a real competitor to the duopoly that we have at the moment.
Well, let me start with the demand, and you're absolutely right. Domestic markets are recovering first, even though it will still take about 3 years for the full recovery of domestic markets, followed by longer distance and wide bodies and international routes. But in the Asia-Pacific region, we are a connected world, and the countries absolutely have the need for long-distance travel, for the economies to recover and grow again. So we have to come back to long-distance travel in the region. The second part of the question is a very, very interesting one. Today, we have two competitors. We strongly encourage competition, and we believe that there is place for a third competitor. We also believe that China as a market is a large enough market that has space for three companies. So we welcome that.
What about people who say that the Chinese manufacturers might even have an edge on Airbus or even then Boeing, because they know how to make planes that do their own domestic short haul, which know how to go into airports that are not so developed, more robust planes that can take the slightly sort of rough and tumble of a less well-developed airport in a developing country?
I really cannot comment on the nature of these aircraft and what strengths that they have. But what I can say is that competition has always made us all better, and there is enough space for three companies to thrive. So we welcome competition.
Let's look also at the Indian market. That was supposed to be one of our biggest markets for aviation in the world pre-COVID. But now we're seeing tremendous numbers of people being infected, a very, very sad and unfortunate death rate. So will the Indian market come back?
Whether I look at the Indian market or the ASEAN market or the Asia-Pacific, 2/3 of the world's population live here, and the majority of them have never flown. And so from a per capita standpoint, how can we prevent them from flying? It is an irreversible equation where aviation is here to stay, and it is at the heart of the economies. And as disturbing, or I would say as disappointing as some parts of this pandemic have been, we do believe there will be a recovery, and recovery not just to air traffic, but to aviation as a continued growth driver of these economies.
You've made it clear what you think, what you're telling governments, is open up, test, put in the protocols, but open up. What would you say, though, to the Asian travel, to the ASEAN traveler? Is there anything at all that we as the ordinary person can do to influence all of this?
Most of us have a very important role to play, which is to have confidence in traveling and to have the willingness to travel, which in turn we're hoping will move governments from the green lanes to the bubbles, and the bubbles to actually opening up of travel completely. And within the ASEAN region, it's no different. These border restrictions have to be removed so that the free trade zone operates and the economies start to flow again.
You've actually taken a flight, which very few people have actually at this point now, when you flew from India to Singapore. Tell me about that.
Well, it was a very interesting flight. As you mentioned, from an experience standpoint, it was nothing like I ever had before, because I had to wear PPE. I had 3 small children with me, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic. But we had to go through the process of the paperwork, the long lines, the waiting times, the approvals to enter, all the safety equipment. prepackaged meals. It was a 4 or 5 hour flight, and we made it out safe because at the end of the day, as I said, air quality in aircraft is really good.
Is the subtext on all of this, though, that you basically both hope and are pushing for us returning to the way it was pre-COVID?
We have to, as societies, return to a pre-COVID level. We hope that it would be after the vaccine comes in. It could be that we're able to put risk mitigation measures that bring back a sense of normalcy before the vaccine also. So the answer is yes, but it's not just about the experience. As I mentioned, when you have 2.5% of all of Asia Pacific employment dependent on aviation, the platform is a much more critical platform we're talking about.
When do you think you are going to take your next flight? And I don't mean a business flight, but one that you would do with your family. When do you realistically think that you will take your 3 kids on a holiday, on a plane?
It's a question of when do borders open and which country they open with. And as soon as they do, I would be the first to get on a flight.
With your kids?
With my family. They may be before me.
Anand Stanley, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.